Today's story is called Mr. Biff the Boxer, and it's written by Allan Ahlberg and illustrated by Janet Ahlberg. Mr. Bop was a boxer. He was fit as a fiddle. He was the toughest man in town. He was the champion. There was another boxer in town. His name was Mr. Biff. Mr. Biff was not as fit as a fiddle. He ate too many little cakes. He drank too many bottles of soda. Mr. Biff was not tough. He liked to sit in an easy chair by a cosy fire. He liked to put his slippers on and read the paper. One day, posters appeared in the town. They said, "Big charity fight, Mr. Biff against Mr. Bop." Mr. Biff told his wife about the fight. "It's for charity," he said. "Me against Mr. Bop." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Biff. "They say he's the toughest man in the town. They say his wife is the toughest woman too," said Mr. Biff. Mrs. Biff told the children about the fight. "It's for charity," she said. "Your dad against Mr. Bop." "Our dad'll win," said Billy Biff. "He will biff him," Betty Biff said. "But your dad is not fit," said Mrs. Biff, "and he is not tough." "We will be his trainers then," said Billy Biff. "And toughen him up," Betty Biff said. The next day, Mr. Biff began training. His family helped. Billy Biff took him running. Betty Biff took him rope jumping. Mrs. Biff hid his paper and his slippers. Bonzo Biff kept him out of the easy chair. The children also helped to toughen him up. Mrs. Biff helped to toughen him up too. They put Mr. Biff on a diet. "I'd like 3 little cakes and a bottle of soda," he said. "You can have 3 carrots and a glass of water," said Mrs. Biff. Each day the children asked, "How do you feel, Dad?" Each day Mr. Biff said, "I feel terrible." But one day the children asked, "How do you feel, Dad?" And Mr. Biff said, "I feel fit as a fiddle." At last the day of the fight came. A big tent was put up in town. Crowds gathered. Everybody was excited. The referee stepped into the ring. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "on my right, Mr. Bop." Everybody cheered. "That's my husband," said Mrs. Bop. "On my left, Mr. Biff." Everybody cheered again. "That's my dad," Billy Biff shouted. The timekeeper rang his bell. Ding, ding! The fight began. Mr. Biff stepped forward. Mr. Bop stepped forward. Mr. Bop moved to the right. Mr. Biff moved to the left. Suddenly, Mr. Bop bopped Mr. Biff. At the same time, Mr. Biff biffed Mr. Bop. They biffed and bopped each other out. "It's a tie," the referee said. The timekeeper rang his bell. Ding, ding! The fight was over. In the dressing room, Mr. Biff said, "How do you feel?" "I feel terrible," said Mr. Bop. "I think bopping people is silly." "Biffing people's silly too," said Mr. Biff. Then Mr. Bop said, "I feel hungry. I've been on a diet." "Me too," said Mr. Biff. "I could eat a whole cake right now." "And a jam tart," said Mr. Bop. "And a cheeseburger," said Mr. Biff. "And a roast chicken and potatoes and peas and bread and butter and a bottle of soda," Mr. Bop said. So that evening, the two families went out for a big dinner. Mrs. Biff made friends with Mrs. Bop. The Biff children made friends with the Bop children. Bonzo Biff even shared a bone with the Bop dog, and a good time was had by all. The end. That was a really good story. Those children worked really hard to get their dad fit as a fiddle, but in the end he decided he didn't want to be a fighter after all. I hope you enjoyed it.